Greetings. I'm Pastor Blaine from Rules Church. Yesterday in worship, we looked at two stories of Jesus, two stories from Mark chapter 10, side by side. Two stories of people looking to Jesus with a request. One, he honored. The other, he turned aside. Surprisingly, the one that Jesus honored, the request that he granted, was from a stranger. The request that he brushed off was by two individuals that he was especially close to, the disciples James and John. Now, looking carefully at these two stories, we saw that the requests came from not only different persons, but from very different places. The request that Jesus brushed off from James and John, we saw really at the end was kind of self-centered, where the request by the man named Bartimaeus, who was blind, put Jesus first. It honored him above self. And now another thing. In the text, there were some more that we did not focus on. There was some things in there that we didn't really spend time on. One of those was verse 41. And verse 41 in the text there, Mark chapter 10, gives the reaction that the other 10 disciples had when they heard what James and John asked of Jesus. When James and John asked to sit on Jesus' right and left when he comes into glory, verse 41 says that they were indignant. Now, the Greek word here means angry. They were angry when they heard what it was that James and John wanted of Jesus. Makes us wonder, why do you think that they were angry with James and John? Were they angry maybe because, they didn't think of this first themselves, or maybe some of them already had thought of something like this, but hadn't had the courage to ask Jesus? That shouldn't be the case, but we've seen time and time again in the Gospels how the disciples could be a bit slow processing what Jesus tells them, the big lessons that he tries to impart upon them, and they were human. So I could see where maybe somebody was jealous, somebody was upset that they didn't think to ask this first, they didn't take their shot. Maybe, though, were they indignant that James and John would ask such a thing in the first place? That how on earth could you ask that of all the things you might ask for? I think that seems a little bit more likely, that they were upset with what it was that James and John asked, not that James and John asked it first and beat them to the punch. And if that's the case, it raises some questions for me, something for us to think about. Who do we think we are? Who do I think I am to judge another's request? If I'm one of those 10 and I'm indignant at James and John for the request that they made of Jesus, who am I to judge their request? Yes, I get it. It's a human thing to do, to judge others. We judge so easily. It's so natural for us to judge basically everything that we see and experience. And if you're thinking about how you might react or respond to requests that you hear another person makes or made of Jesus, there's probably a good chance you're going to think some of the things that some people ask are inappropriate. Maybe you think that something that someone asked of Jesus is ridiculous, or it would be unfair if Jesus would grant the request that someone asks. Whatever. There's maybe a lot of things that we might think about things that others ask of Jesus that would leave us feeling indignant. And maybe we might even be right some of the time that was a request that really was not worthy of Jesus. But deep down, do we know what is in a person's heart? Do you know the whole story? Do you know the context behind? Do you know if Jesus had reached out to them first and they were simply answering from their heart? Do you really know deep down what is going on? Of course we don't. Not like Jesus knew. And in the case in Scripture today with James and John, Jesus was already dealing with this matter. So now, if you're one of the 10 and Jesus is dealing with this matter and Jesus seems to be moving on from it. Maybe the other 10 should have just kind of let it go and moved on as well. Even if they were a little bit upset, just move on. Maybe the 10 should have simply seen a cautionary tale in James and John. James and John made a request, and Jesus lets it go pretty quickly, pretty decisively. Maybe they should have noted a lesson for themselves to remember when they're coming up with their own ideas for Jesus. When they're thinking, gee, maybe I ought to ask, maybe they should remember James and John and really think through what it is that they might want to ask of Jesus. Of course, if they did just let it go and not come to the level that Jesus responded to it, we might not have gotten the teaching that they did get out of this teaching about serving. It's pretty profound, so there is that too. But hopefully it makes you think about how it is that we respond to others about the way that they respond to Jesus. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge. Well, that's it for this week. I hope that you will join us next Sunday in worship and see what's going on here in the next week of Lent, when we're going to look at a parable that Jesus teaches about a man who planted a vineyard and who had some tenants. It's a pretty harsh story. It's got some pretty important lessons. Hope to see you then. Till then, be blessed.